Night settled over the war-torn edges of Europe, with a weight that felt almost deliberate, as if the darkness itself were aware of the secrets it was about to swallow. In the winter of 1944, when the continent was nothing more than a shivering mosaic of fear and fractured alliances, a single name pulsed through the hidden channels of Allied intelligence with a mixture of urgency and dread. Oberstleutnant Heinrich Falk, a Nazi officer known for his cold efficiency and an unsettling ability to vanish into the folds of occupied territory, had reportedly agreed to an unprecedented clandestine meeting with high-ranking Allied intermediaries. No one could explain why a man so deeply embedded in the Nazi hierarchy would risk everything to speak with the enemy, nor why he insisted that the meeting occur in absolute isolation, somewhere beyond the borders of official maps. What the Allies would later find of him was not a body, nor a confession, nor even the expected trail of conflict. Instead, they would find nothing at all, as if the earth itself had opened and swallowed him whole. The journey to that meeting began long before the snow-choked path that would eventually become his undoing. Falk had been a rising figure in the German military structure, a strategist valued not for his loyalty but for his precision, a man whose silence often spoke more than the bombastic rhetoric of the officers around him. While others clung fanatically to the ideology of the regime, Falk moved with a different shadow behind his eyes, one that no report could adequately capture. It was said that he kept meticulous notes in a journal he carried everywhere, a journal filled not with military calculations but with observations about human behavior, about the fragility of moral boundaries, about the strange duality of obedience and guilt. Whispers spread that he had seen too much on the Eastern Front, that the weight of certain orders had etched itself into his conscience, threatening to fracture the hardened shell of the soldier he had been trained to become. Rumors are dangerous things during wartime, and in 1944 they drifted like ash in the wind, settling where they were least welcome. Allied intelligence captured fragments of intercepted messages, coded exchanges that appeared to originate from Falk's operational circles. Hidden within them were references to dissension, to information being withheld from Nazi command, to a possible asset too valuable to ignore. It was through these threads that the Allies approached him cautiously, testing the possibility that Falk might defect, or at the very least provide insights that could be used against his own regime. The decision to meet him in person was not made lightly, and preparations for the encounter were buried beneath layers of secrecy so dense that even the operatives involved would later question whether the meeting had ever truly been sanctioned. Falk traveled alone, disguised in the muted garb of a civilian, carrying with him only a small leather case, and the unsettling resignation of a man aware that any misstep could result in immediate execution. The rendezvous point lay deep within a forest that had once belonged to a quiet rural community, before the sound of artillery transformed the landscape into a labyrinth of skeletal trees and ice-coated ruins. Falk moved through the desolation like a phantom, the crunch of snow beneath his boots muffled by the oppressive stillness that had come to define the winter of 1944. He was watched from a distance by Allied operatives who had been instructed not to reveal themselves until he reached the exact coordinates, until the final moment when the fragile bridge between enemy lines could be crossed or severed. Halfway along the frozen trail, something shifted within the air, as if the forest itself had grown aware of Falk's presence. His breathing slowed. He sensed movement, the faintest tremor of footsteps behind him. When he turned, there was nothing but the wind, dragging loose flakes across the path, like drifting ash. Still, he pressed forward, his fingers brushing against the case he carried. a case whose contents would later give rise to theories far beyond the scope of documented history. It is here, in the middle of this path, swallowed by winter and war, where the cold mystery begins to coil around the story like fog around a graveyard. And speaking of paths converging, it's the perfect moment to ask you something as our story deepens. From where are you watching this video? Let your voice echo faintly in the comments below, as if joining the footsteps that once followed Falk into the dark. The allies who awaited him described the hours before the meeting as unnaturally silent. Birds had vanished. Even the distant thunder of artillery seemed muted, as though the world was holding its breath. The officers positioned at the meeting point were seasoned men, individuals who had witnessed the worst cruelties of the war. Yet something about this night unsettled even them. They reported an inexplicable sense of distortion within the forest, a disturbance that made the air feel thicker, as if it resisted movement. When Falk finally appeared through the drifting veil of snow, they noted that his expression carried the haunted distance of someone who had already seen the end of his path long before reaching it. He exchanged no pleasantries. His voice was low, strained, almost reluctant. Before he could reveal anything of value, before a single detail of intelligence could be recorded, something occurred that the surviving operatives would later struggle to articulate. The forest groaned with an unnatural vibration, a sound not of machinery, nor weather, nor enemy forces. The ground trembled faintly, like the exhale of something immense and hidden beneath the surface. The Allied officers reached instinctively for their weapons, but Falk raised a hand, urging them to remain still. His eyes widened, not with fear, but with the eerie recognition of someone who had been expecting this moment, someone who had reached a pre-written point in a long-buried script. Then the darkness swallowed him. There was no struggle, no outcry, no flash of gunfire. One moment, Falk stood inches from the men who sought his secrets. The next, he was gone, dissolved into the shadows between the trees, as if he had stepped backward through a door that none of them could see. Panic fractured the silence. Searchlights flashed. Orders were shouted. The forest was scoured for hours, then days, then weeks. No footprints, no traces, no signs of conflict. The only physical remnant discovered was his case, lying untouched upon the snow where he had last stood. Inside, investigators found only a blank journal, its pages crisp and white, as if waiting for words that Falk had never been allowed to write. For decades, the disappearance remained sealed within classified archives, dismissed by some as a failed extraction, by others as deliberate sabotage, and by a select few as evidence of something far stranger than betrayal or abduction. But the most unsettling layer of the mystery emerged much later, in 2015, when construction workers in a remote region of Germany unearthed an identification card buried beneath several meters of disturbed earth. It bore Falk's name. It bore his photograph. And yet, according to the forensic analysis recorded in discrete internal memos, the ID itself had been printed using technology that did not exist during the war. A fake identity created long after he disappeared, an artifact appearing where it should not have been, belonging to a man who should have died over 70 years earlier. What happened to Heinrich Falk between those frozen trees? Who forged his identity decades after he vanished? And why did it resurface only when the world had nearly forgotten his name? As the forest closes behind him, and the past begins its slow, cold ascension toward the present. If this story still holds your breath captive, consider letting the shadows around us grow even deeper by subscribing to the channel, a small act that helps keep these lost histories alive in the dark. The forest where Heinrich Falk vanished was never marked on any official wartime map, yet locals from nearby villages whispered about it long after the war ended. They called it Der leere Wald, the empty forest, a name born not from myth, but from an eerie truth. No birds sang there, no animals crossed its interior paths, and those who ventured too far inside spoke of feeling watched, as if something ancient and patient lived between the trees. In the years following the war, when Allied forces occupied what was left of the region, patrols were sent to document and secure the area. But the reports that came back were inconsistent, often incomplete, and laced with quiet dread. Some soldiers claimed their compasses spun uncontrollably within the forest. Others reported hearing low mechanical hums beneath the soil, sounds that faded the moment they were acknowledged. A few even refused to return, insisting that the air itself seemed wrong. Too heavy, too still, as if the forest had been hollowed out by the absence of something essential. Among the archival material that survived, one document in particular stands out, a typewritten field report dated February 1945, authored by an Allied intelligence officer named Major Ellis Morrow. His report, classified for over 70 years, provides the most detailed post-incident account of the investigation into Falk's disappearance. Morrow wrote that upon arriving at the supposed meeting site, he found no trace of disturbance consistent with a firefight or forced capture. Instead, there was only the impression of a single set of footprints leading into the woods and vanishing abruptly, as though Falk had simply ceased to exist halfway through a stride. Morrow described the ground as too smooth, unnaturally compacted, as if exposed to extreme pressure or heat, yet there were no burn marks, no debris, no scent of combustion. His closing words are perhaps the most chilling. The forest absorbed him. That's the only conclusion that fits. The Allied command, they dismissed Morrow's claims as psychological stress, a not uncommon result of prolonged exposure to battlefield trauma. But there were details he omitted from his official record that later surfaced in a series of personal notes discovered by his granddaughter decades later. These handwritten fragments, now in the possession of a private collector, paint a darker and more intricate picture. Morrow confessed that shortly before Falk's disappearance, British intelligence had intercepted a strange coded message transmitted through an obscure channel of Nazi communication known as Project Heimkehr, or Project Homecoming. Its exact purpose was never determined, but it was believed to involve experiments in time displacement, consciousness manipulation, and the retrieval of lost operatives. The name Falk appeared several times within these transmissions, paired with references to coordinates that matched the forest in which he vanished. Could Falk have been more than a defector? Could he have been part of an internal project meant to test the limits of human disappearance itself? The idea might sound like the architecture of conspiracy, yet the documents align too precisely to ignore. Project Heimkehr was allegedly overseen by a covert division of the SS's Erbe, the infamous research institute dedicated to exploring occult and pseudoscientific theories in pursuit of Aryan superiority. Within this organization existed a smaller, more obscure unit called Abteilung 7, or Section 7, specializing in psychological warfare and experimental technologies that blurred the line between science and mysticism. Reports of their experiments, fragmentary at best, mentioned devices that manipulated electromagnetic fields, sound frequencies, and even environmental perception. Witnesses who later testified at Nuremberg spoke of rooms where soldiers entered for evaluation and never emerged again, of diaries filled with incoherent symbols and of strange black-and-white photographs depicting impossible distortions in the landscape around human subjects. Heinrich Falk, according to surviving personnel records, had been attached to Abteilung 7 during his early career, long before his promotion to the rank of Oberstleutnant. His transfer orders were signed by a name that appears repeatedly in SS experimental archives, Dr. Dieter Hölz, a physicist whose fascination with field resonance and human consciousness had earned him both ridicule and quiet funding. Hölz believed that under certain conditions, the human body could act as a kind of antenna, able to receive or transmit frequencies beyond ordinary perception. He theorized that if properly amplified, this resonance could shift matter through unstable space, creating what he described in his journals as momentary breaches of the physical continuum. These ideas were dismissed by the mainstream scientific community, yet within the closed walls of Nazi research, they found fertile ground. Falk was Hölz's favored subject. Described as calm, detached, and unusually resistant to stress, Falk reportedly underwent several exposure trials designed to test the body's reaction to intense low-frequency vibrations. The experiments were said to induce hallucinations, the disorientation, and an overwhelming sensation of weightlessness, as though the body itself was being partially erased. Officially, these trials ended in 1943, but internal memos indicate they continued in secret until the spring of 1944, precisely when Falk began making inquiries into contact with Allied intermediaries. It is here that the lines blur, where Falk ceases to be a loyal officer and begins to appear as a man aware of forces he no longer understood, forces that perhaps no human should have attempted to command. Some historians believe Falk's defection attempt was motivated by fear, not treachery, that he intended to warn the Allies of something catastrophic hidden within the Reich's deepest laboratories. But others speculate that his disappearance during the meeting was not an accident, that the breach Hölz theorized had followed him, waiting like a silent echo beneath the frozen ground. When Falk stepped into that forest, he may have triggered the same resonance that once rattled his body in the laboratories of Abteilung 7, collapsing the fragile barrier between where he was and where he was meant to be. And yet, the appearance of his false identification card in 2015 complicates everything. The ID, verified by Germany's Federal Criminal Police Office, was manufactured using synthetic polymers and printing techniques introduced in the 1980s. Its authenticity was unquestionable, yet its anachronism defied logic. Analysts noted subtle inconsistencies in the typography, specifically the serial numbering style, matching a format that would not exist until 1993. DNA analysis from residue on the card was inconclusive, yet trace elements found within the laminate suggested exposure to soil rich in cesium-137, a byproduct of post-war nuclear testing. The card was unearthed beneath what had once been the outer boundary of Der Leerwald, an area sealed off during the Cold War due to unexplained magnetic anomalies. What was it doing there? Who buried it? And why did it bear Falk's unmistakable face, unchanged since 1944? Local archives from the 1960s mention a series of disappearances near that same forest: 4 hikers, 2 surveyors, and 1 local hunter, all vanishing without trace. Police found their vehicles abandoned, engines still warm, radios crackling faint static. In every instance, the missing were last seen near the coordinates that matched Morrow's original report. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the most disturbing of these incidents occurred in 1968, when a survey team employed by the East German government discovered fragments of a field uniform buried beneath frost. The insignia had decayed, But one brass tag remained legible: Heinrich Falk. The object was quietly confiscated, and official records of the find were erased from state files. To this day, the forest remains restricted. There are no official signs, no fences, only the whispered warnings of locals who claim that at night, faint lights can be seen weaving between the trees, and that sometimes, when the wind is still, you can hear a voice speaking in German, calm and deliberate, repeating coordinates that lead nowhere. If you've reached this far and can still feel the tension clawing at the edges of your curiosity, let it draw you deeper. The story is just beginning to open its wounds. And if you wish to walk further into the dark with me, subscribe to the channel so you don't lose the trail when the shadows start moving on their own. By the time the Cold War cast its long and silent shadow over Europe, Heinrich Falk had become little more than a footnote, an unsolved disappearance buried beneath 1,000 more immediate horrors. Yet in the hidden corners of intelligence archives, his name refused to die. Between 1952 and 1963, declassified communications from MI6 and the CIA reveal that both agencies maintained what they called Project Mirrorfall, a joint investigation into anomalous Nazi-era phenomena linked to potential Cold War applications. Among the hundreds of leads catalogued, Falk's case was given high priority, not because of who he was, but because of where he vanished. The coordinates of that forest appeared repeatedly in unrelated Soviet reconnaissance reports, as if something beneath the soil had drawn attention from both sides of the Iron Curtain. In one particularly obscure CIA memorandum dated July 1956, a field operative stationed in West Germany described a mission to photograph unusual radiation patterns along a stretch of woodland north of Kassel, the same area associated with Der Lehrwald. The agent, identified only as L. Grayson, wrote that the readings spiked dramatically at intervals, forming a pattern that repeated every 72 hours. What disturbed him most was that during one of these peaks, his Geiger counter ceased functioning entirely, its needle frozen mid-measurement, while the surrounding air seemed to shimmer, as though heat were rising from invisible embers. When the distortion subsided, Grayson and his partner reported a smell, ozone and iron, and a faint imprint in the snow resembling a human outline. They fled the area, but before doing so, Grayson snapped a single photograph. That photograph was filed away and sealed. When it was reopened in 1984, analysts noted what appeared to be the faint silhouette of a man standing several meters behind the agent's intended frame, partially transparent, his features blurred, but unmistakably wearing a WT-era German officer's coat. For years, the image circulated among intelligence circles, its authenticity debated, its origin questioned, but something about it was too consistent to ignore. Facial reconstruction specialists later determined that the silhouette's proportions matched the surviving photographs of Heinrich Falk almost perfectly. A man dead for over a decade appeared to have been captured on camera, standing in a forest that should have been silent, empty, forgotten. The event reignited speculation about Project Heimkehr and its alleged experiments in resonance and temporal distortion. Theorists within the intelligence community began proposing that Falk's disappearance might not have been a death, but a displacement, a failed or partial transition through whatever device or phenomenon Holtz and his team had attempted to harness. Some believed Falk had been trapped within an unstable field, cycling through phases of visibility across time, forever tethered to the place where he vanished. Others, more grounded but equally unsettled, suggested that he had survived and resurfaced, adopting new identities throughout the Cold War, using information gleaned from his former Nazi networks. But neither theory could explain the 2015 discovery of the ID card, a document whose physical composition indicated it had been buried for decades, yet bore none of the decay expected from such conditions. The trail might have ended there, lost beneath the weight of bureaucracy and myth, had it not been for a retired Polish historian named Dr. Marek Nowak. In 2013, Nowak stumbled upon an unmarked folder while digitizing the archives of the former Ministry of Internal Affairs in Warsaw. Inside were 4 photographs, 3 correspondences, and a single, torn map. The photographs were grainy, depicting the same forest clearing from different angles, but in the final image, dated March 1945, months after Falk's disappearance, a small structure could be seen in the background, a hut, built hastily, covered in snow and branches, with symbols painted in black on its door. The letters HF were faintly visible beneath them. The coordinates written on the back matched those recorded in Morrow's field report. Intrigued, Nowak visited the site, accompanied by a film crew documenting post-war legends for a regional history project. Their journey, recorded on low-quality digital film, captured something no one was prepared for. As they approached the coordinates, one of their compass needles began to spin uncontrollably, mimicking the Allied accounts from 1945. Electronic equipment malfunctioned. Microphones hissed with bursts of static and strange low frequencies, like distant mechanical breathing. When they reached the clearing, the hut was gone, but the air felt heavier, saturated with metallic cold. They found fragments of old wood buried beneath snow and moss, charred yet unrotted, as if preserved by unnatural conditions. Beneath the debris, half fused into the frozen ground, they uncovered what appeared to be a section of uniform fabric. Analysis later confirmed it was consistent with Wehrmacht material from the 1940s, but the fibers were unlike anything produced at the time. Denser, smoother, chemically resistant, as if altered. Nowak's footage was quietly confiscated by German authorities shortly after its release. Officially, it was removed due to safety concerns and national preservation protocols. Unofficially, it disappeared into the vaults of the Bundesnachrichtendienst, Germany's foreign intelligence agency, where it remains sealed. But fragments of the footage leaked online months later, fueling conspiracy forums and dark history channels. In one frame, visible for less than 2 seconds, an image appears, blurred, indistinct, yet haunting. A human figure standing just at the edge of the tree line, its posture rigid, its head slightly tilted, as if watching. Some say the figure wears a Nazi officer's cap. Others claim it's just a shadow caught by coincidence. But when researchers digitally enhanced the frame, a reflection became visible in a piece of glass embedded in the ground. 2 eyes, pale and unblinking, staring directly into the camera lens. Was it Falk? A ghost? A trick of light born from digital decay? No one could agree, but the pattern was undeniable. The forest still responded to his name, as if bound to it, as if the earth itself had memorized his presence. Dr. Nowak never returned to the site. Within 6 months, he disappeared from public life, his academic email deactivated, his last known correspondence addressed to an unnamed recipient in the United Kingdom. The message contained only one line: "He is still here, but not as we understand the word here." Authorities dismissed it as the ramblings of a man overtaken by obsession, but his family insists he changed before vanishing. his demeanor quiet, withdrawn, as though he had glimpsed something that refused to leave his mind. By the late 2010s, the Falk case had transcended history and entered the realm of legend. Online communities began dissecting every surviving photograph, cross-referencing metadata, even traveling to the coordinates themselves. Some claimed to experience the same anomalies described for decades: malfunctioning equipment, distorted sound, sudden drops in temperature, and above all, a sensation of being watched. One user, identified only by the pseudonym Grey Talon, uploaded an infrared scan taken from the forest edge. The image showed what appeared to be multiple heat signatures in the shape of human figures, arranged in a circle. When authorities followed up days later, the user's account was deleted and his digital footprint erased. What then is der leere Wald? A place scarred by war, or something else entirely, something that swallowed war and everything that came with it? Could it be that Hölz's experiments fractured more than space and time, creating a point of permanent resonance where moments overlap, bleed together, and never fully die? If so, perhaps Falk was not erased, but multiplied, his presence flickering like a broken film reel between decades, glimpsed only when the air aligns with the frequency of his disappearance. And as you listen to these echoes of a soldier who may never have stopped walking through that forest, let the silence between my words remind you that history rarely stays buried. It hums, it shifts, it remembers. And if these stories draw you in, if they make you wonder what else the war has refused to release into daylight, take a breath and subscribe to the channel so you won't lose your way when we descend deeper, where the truth begins to warp. The winter of 1944 had frozen Europe into a brittle reflection of its own despair. But it was within that same frozen silence that the first threads of something inexplicable began to weave themselves through history. For years after Falk's disappearance, whispers of his name re-emerged in reports that should not have been connected. Memos filed in separate languages from separate governments, describing separate events. Yet when viewed together, a pattern emerged, faint but undeniable, like a frequency humming just beneath the static of history itself. One of the earliest such mentions came from a French intelligence report dated 1947. It described a captured German informant, delirious from exposure, claiming to have seen der Offizier ohne Schatten, the officer without a shadow, wandering near the ruins of a bombed-out railway depot in Essen. According to the witness, the man wore an immaculate officer's coat and carried a small case clutched tightly in one hand. When confronted, the figure reportedly vanished into thin air, leaving only the echo of a single step and the scent of burning ozone. The story was dismissed as madness brought on by trauma, yet the detail of the case matched perfectly the description of the one Falk had carried to his meeting with the Allies. In 1959, similar accounts surfaced from the Soviet archives, classified testimonies from guards stationed at a remote facility near Königssee, tasked with securing what remained of a wartime research bunker. Multiple guards reported hearing rhythmic knocking from within the sealed underground chambers long after the facility had been abandoned. When engineers finally forced entry, they found no bodies, no signs of movement, only deep impressions in the concrete floor, spaced like footprints, circling endlessly in the dust. The official conclusion described the phenomenon as structural resonance caused by air pressure shifts. But within one of the personal diaries recovered from the site, a sentence had been hastily scrawled in German: sucht den Ausgang. He is looking for the exit. The deeper investigators dug, the more the impossible began to overlap with the verifiable. Declassified Ahnenerbe documents from the final months of the war refer to Experiment Nullpunkt, the zero-point procedure, conducted under the supervision of Dr. Dieter Hölz. The papers describe an attempt to separate consciousness from temporality, a process supposedly achieved through synchronized vibrations and low-frequency electromagnetic waves emitted through a prototype known as Gerät Falkenlicht, the Falcon Light device. It is unclear whether the machine was named after Falk, or whether Falk himself had become the device's final subject. The experiment's outcome was recorded in a single sentence. Contact achieved. Duration indefinite. Subject unresponsive. The Allied intelligence that recovered these documents during the Nuremberg investigations dismissed them as pseudoscientific nonsense, propaganda meant to obscure more practical wartime research. Yet buried within the same cache was a photograph taken weeks before Falk's disappearance. In it, Hölz and several SS officers stand around a circular apparatus resembling a metal frame, cables snaking from its base into the concrete floor. To one side, a man in uniform faces away from the camera, his features blurred, but his build and insignia unmistakably match Heinrich Falk. No one has ever explained how the original photograph came to include faint streaks of light spiraling around the device. Patterns consistent not with damage or exposure, but motion, as though the machine were active at the exact moment the camera shutter opened. Decades later, in 1972, the East German Ministry for State Security, known as the Stasi, reopened an investigation into wartime anomalies following a string of unexplained disappearances near the Harz Mountains. Their files, declassified after the fall of the Berlin Wall, reveal that investigators discovered remnants of an underground structure identical in layout to those described in Hölz's documents. Within it were strange metallic fragments, some melted into the rock itself, others pulsing faint electromagnetic readings even decades later. When a team of scientists attempted to transport one of the fragments to Berlin, the convoy vanished en route. The lead researcher's journal, later recovered from a roadside ditch, contained one final entry written hours before his disappearance. He is awake beneath the forest. It was around this time that reports began circulating among black market artifact collectors of a man claiming to sell objects from the other side. He spoke fluent German with an accent too old-fashioned for the modern era, dressed in outdated clothing, and carried with him a single item for demonstration: a worn leather case with initials carved faintly on its handle. HFF. The man vanished before any verification could be made, leaving behind only a business card with a location scrawled on the back. Coordinates pointing once again to Der Lehrwald. Historians like to speak of patterns, but patterns like this are something else entirely. Threads woven across decades by unseen hands, connecting events that logic cannot sustain. The notion that Falk somehow survived, trapped between eras or existing within an unending loop of his own disappearance, has become more than a legend among those who study wartime anomalies. They speak of the Falk field, an invisible resonance still pulsing beneath the forest floor, distorting magnetic fields, disrupting memory, and perhaps even time itself. One particular account, from 1989, stands apart. A Soviet defector, codenamed Vesna, claimed that before the fall of the Berlin Wall, she had been assigned to a covert research initiative codenamed Sektor Nullpunkt. The operation sought to reopen a temporal breach located near an abandoned bunker in northern Germany. She described complex machinery buried beneath meters of concrete, powered by unknown energy sources that emitted a sound like breathing through static. When asked what the objective was, she responded with a single phrase that chilled her interrogators: to retrieve the man who was never retrieved. Her handlers dismissed the testimony as disinformation, but decades later, the coordinates she provided aligned perfectly with those of Der Lehrwald. The more one traces this story, the more it begins to feel as though time itself has folded around it. Every few decades, someone vanishes in that forest. Every few decades, something reappears. Sometimes it is an artifact, sometimes a voice caught on malfunctioning equipment, sometimes the faint outline of a man seen between the trees. And every single time, the pattern begins again, as if Falk's presence demands witnesses, as if history refuses to let him dissolve completely. In the winter of 2015, the same year his forged identification surfaced, a hiker uploaded a short video to an online forum dedicated to urban exploration. The video was taken at night. The title read simply, "Voices in Castle Woods." For the first 2 minutes it was uneventful, just snow crunching underfoot, the sound of wind, and the hiker's nervous breathing. Then, faintly, a voice began to murmur in the background. The language was German, the tone calm, almost instructional. A translation later identified the words as, "Step back, you are not meant to see." The clip ended abruptly with a burst of static and the sound of the hiker running. When authorities traced the uploader's account days later, it had been deleted. No one ever came forward claiming to be the person in the footage. And still, the forest waits, unchanged, impenetrable, suspended in the same quiet tension it has carried since that night in 1944 when Heinrich Falk stepped into its frozen mouth and never came out. Whether he was the victim of his own invention, the result of a failed experiment, or something far beyond human comprehension, one truth remains. His story resists closure. Like a pulse beneath ice, it continues to thrum, faint but persistent, through the decades. If you're still listening, if the darkness of this story has managed to reach you wherever you are, then you already understand. Some stories don't end. They circle, they echo, they pull us back toward the same question again and again. What really happened to Heinrich Falk? And before we descend further into the shadows of his legacy and what came after, remember to subscribe to the channel so the next chapter of this mystery doesn't vanish into silence before you hear it. By the time the world entered the 21st century, Heinrich Falk's name had passed from historical obscurity into the cold glow of the digital age, where folklore, conspiracy, and fragmented truth fused into a single, pulsing myth. The Internet became the new archive of shadows, and Der Lehrwald its cathedral. Amateur historians, digital archaeologists, and anonymous users began piecing together data points that governments had buried for decades, and in doing so, they awakened something, perhaps not supernatural, but something undeniably sentient in its persistence. Every file recovered, every photo unearthed, seemed to whisper the same message between the lines. Falk's story was not over. In 2015, the discovery of his forged ID had reignited public fascination, but it was the analysis that followed which made the story impossible to dismiss. German forensic labs concluded the ID was composed of advanced polymer materials consistent with high-security government production. Yet the embedded micro-trace patterns in the laminate indicated microscopic oxidation, consistent with having been exposed to natural elements for over 50 years. A paradox. Modern materials that had aged impossibly. Moreover, the ID number sequence corresponded not to any existing post-war German format, but to an internal classification pattern used by NATO intelligence operatives in the late 1970s. Whoever had forged the document understood government cryptography intimately, or had access to knowledge that should have been impossible for a man dead since 1944. It was around this time that a new piece of evidence surfaced, one that pushed Falk's mystery beyond the realm of legend and into a new dimension of unease. A German archivist named Lukas Bauer uploaded a brief clip to a restricted historical database in late 2001. The video, labeled Recovered Reel, Bundesfilmarchiv B784, appeared to be a deteriorated 6mm film reel dated April 1945, found among confiscated Nazi propaganda materials. What set it apart, however, was its content. The first 20 seconds showed an ordinary wartime recording. Soldiers loading equipment, a vehicle passing by, blurred faces in uniform. But halfway through, the camera jolted, turning toward an open field where a figure stood, perfectly still. The man's uniform identified him as a German officer, but the insignia was faded, unrecognizable. More disturbing was the motion, or rather, the lack of it. He did not move. Not even the wind affected his coat. He stood as if detached from the world around him. The frame trembled, the light distorted, and for 2 seconds, only 2, his face became clear. He was looking directly at the camera. His features were unmistakable. Heinrich Falk. The reel was examined by experts from multiple institutions, and no signs of tampering were found. The film stock was authentic, consistent with 1940s production, the grain and deterioration matching historical samples. There was no splice, no double exposure, yet the scene it depicted was not possible. It had been filmed months after Falk's disappearance. What's more, the location of the footage, confirmed by landscape comparison, matched the coordinates of Der Leer Wald. Lukas Bauer, the archivist who released the clip, vanished 3 weeks later. His apartment was left undisturbed, his personal computer wiped clean. The only file left behind was a single line of text on his desktop. The image doesn't stay still when you look at it for too long. The video spread quietly through dark web forums dedicated to wartime anomalies, until it reached the hands of a small collective of independent researchers known as the Oubliette Network, composed of former military analysts, sound engineers, and digital forensics experts. Their stated goal was to study the persistence of lost phenomena. In 2017, they launched the Falk Hypothesis, an investigation blending digital archaeology with field exploration. Their research led them directly into Der Leer Wald. The Oubliette expedition lasted 3 days. Only fragments of their findings were ever made public, but their recovered data paints a picture too haunting to ignore. Their geospatial readings detected irregular magnetic waves forming concentric circles beneath the soil, all pulsing at a frequency of 19 Hz, the same frequency historically associated with inducing feelings of unease and hallucinations in the human brain. Infrasound. Yet, within those frequencies, a pattern was discovered, a faint modulation resembling Morse code. When transcribed, it formed a single repeating phrase, Zurück zum Ursprung, return to the origin. The team's lead researcher, identified only as V, described a moment during the second night when one of their cameras began recording autonomously, despite being powered off. The footage showed nothing but darkness and heavy breathing, followed by a voice, calm, precise, distinctly German, saying, "You shouldn't have brought light here." The device then shut down, No one on the team recalled speaking those words. The expedition ended abruptly. 2 members refused to return to the forest. Another was later admitted to a psychiatric facility after claiming to have seen a man standing inside the air. The remaining members went silent, and the Oubliette Network's website was deleted without explanation. But whispers persist that they succeeded in uncovering a chamber deep beneath the forest, buried under layers of rock and frost. A circular structure of iron and stone, its walls covered in symbols similar to those found in Hölz's experimental notes. The chamber's design, when mapped, formed a perfect spiral, a structure mathematically aligned with the same frequency patterns emitted from beneath the forest floor. Whether it was a bunker, a laboratory, or something else entirely, remains uncertain. But according to the few who claim to have seen their footage before it disappeared, there was something, or someone, preserved within that chamber, a human form fused into the wall, face turned upward, mouth open in a silent scream. From that point onward, the story of Falk transcended its origins as a wartime enigma. It became an allegory for something deeper, a representation of the point where human ambition collides with the incomprehensible, where science and myth bleed into one another. Some call Falk a ghost. Others call him a time-locked prisoner of his own creation, endlessly cycling through the moment of his disappearance. But those who've studied the physics behind Project Heimkehr and its later Cold War echoes believe something else entirely, that Falk was the first, and perhaps only, human being to experience dimensional displacement, not across time, but across the perception of time itself. To him, the night of 1944 may never have ended. Still, tangible echoes of his presence continued to surface. Shortwave radio operators have reported bursts of German phrases transmitted on dead frequencies near the coordinates of Kassel, repeating in cycles at intervals too precise to be natural. Linguists analyzing the recordings noted that the accent was distinctly pre-war, old-fashioned, formal, and eerily calm. The voice identified itself as H. Falk and delivered cryptic messages about completion, the barrier, and the return. When triangulated, the transmissions traced directly back to the area of Der Leerwald. Yet when search teams investigated, the forest was silent. No transmitters, no signs of interference. Only the quiet hum of the trees and the faint metallic taste in the air. At this point, the rational mind rebels. And yet history is full of moments where the rational world cracks, where unexplained gaps remain untouched, as if reality itself refuses to close them. Falk's case might be one of those fractures, a wound through which the war still bleeds into the present. Whether he became a victim of his own experiment or a fragment of something we were never meant to see, he has transcended every barrier meant to contain him. They say that on certain nights, when fog settles heavy over Der Leerwald, if you stand perfectly still, you can hear footsteps approaching behind you, slow, deliberate, and impossibly measured. When you turn, there is no one there. But if you listen closely, you might catch a whisper in German, faint and almost tender. Es ist noch nicht vorbei. It is not over yet. If the chill of this story is already pressing at the edge of your thoughts, you know what comes next. Like this video to keep the shadows awake, and subscribe to the channel, because the final piece of Falk's disappearance is waiting, buried just beneath the surface of everything you've heard so far. The final traces of Heinrich Falk do not belong to history. They belong to the space between it, the liminal corridors where time, sound, and memory lose their meaning. By the time researchers and clandestine agencies had finished tearing through the fabric of his disappearance, all that remained was noise. A deep, trembling resonance that could be recorded but never explained. It vibrated through the soil beneath Der Leerwald, through power lines, through archival tapes. It became a pulse, faint but insistent, like something trying to return to form. And yet, even pulses can be decoded. In late 2018, a small research initiative from the University of Bonn began studying acoustic anomalies in historically contaminated environments. Among their sites was the same stretch of woodland near Kassel that had long since been abandoned to moss and silence. Their aim was not paranormal. They were analyzing low-frequency noise caused by buried munitions and decaying metals. But the recordings they captured were unlike anything ever measured in an ordinary geological survey. Beneath the natural resonance of the forest lay a deeper pattern, rhythmic, mechanical, and terrifyingly deliberate. It pulsed at irregular intervals, sometimes one every 7 seconds, sometimes faster, and between those pulses were modulations, faint but traceable. When the data was visualized through spectrographic analysis, a pattern appeared. Oscillations shaped not by random decay, but by structure. Within the structure, the letters H and F repeated over and over again, forming what looked like an artificial signature, a pattern that, according to every scientific principle, should not have existed. The researchers kept the discovery private at first, reluctant to attract the storm of conspiracy that surrounded Falk's legend. But curiosity soon overcame caution. In March 2019, they returned with more sensitive instruments, hoping to isolate the signal. This time, the forest seemed to respond to them. Audio devices malfunctioned. 2 of the cameras failed. Static filled the recordings in bursts that came and went with the rhythm of breathing. And then, in the final minute of one of their logs, a voice appeared, distant, disembodied, distorted by low-frequency vibration. The translation, when processed later, was unmistakably German. Do not let them close it again. What it referred to was never clear. By dawn, the lead researcher, Professor Alina Kramer, had vanished. Her team found her recorder lying in the snow beside an overturned tripod. Its last entry contained a single sound, the faint ticking of a watch that no one on the team owned. After her disappearance, German authorities sealed the forest once again, declaring it a contaminated historical zone. Officially, no further studies were authorized. Unofficially, however, the recordings continued to circulate among intelligence specialists and acoustic researchers across Europe. One of them, an unnamed sound engineer who had worked on Cold War signal analysis, claimed that when he slowed the recording to 1/10 of its speed, he could hear the faint cadence of marching boots beneath the static. Not random footsteps, but organized, precise, military. There are moments in history when truth refuses to fit into the human frame of understanding. Falk's story is one of them. He was never found because perhaps he was never meant to be. There are no bones, no verified body, no conclusive proof that he died. Only the fragments, an impossible ID card, a voice on dead radio frequencies, a name that appears again and again in archives that should never have intersected, and the photographs. The last known photograph of Heinrich Falk was published anonymously on an encrypted forum in December 2020. It showed a desolate clearing, leafless trees, and what appeared to be a figure standing at a distance, motion blurred, indistinct, but undeniably human. The EKSF data confirmed it had been taken near Kassel, at the edge of Der Leerwald. Embedded in the photo's metadata was a message written in binary code. When translated, it formed a sentence in English. He never stopped walking. Experts dismissed it as a hoax, yet even they admitted that the shadow on the figure's left side appeared unnatural, elongated, almost detached from the body, as if the light had bent around him. When the image was enhanced, faint patterns emerged along the coat's surface, resembling runic symbols, the same ones painted on the door of the hut discovered by Dr. Nowak decades earlier. The image's uploader was never identified. The post disappeared within hours, along with the entire thread discussing it. But those who saw it before it vanished said something unsettling about the file, that it changed depending on who opened it. For some, the figure stood in the center of the clearing. For others, he was closer, nearer to the camera, face blurred in motion. And for one user, whose comment was archived before deletion, the file played a faint audio track when opened. It was not part of the image. The sound was distant thunder, followed by a whisper. Ich habe sie gewarnt. I warned them. No one can say what truly became of Heinrich Falk. Some believe he was consumed by his own experiment, erased from existence in a failed attempt to control a power that transcended physics. Others argue that he succeeded, that his disappearance was not a failure, but a transition, an evolution into something that exists beyond time, where moments fold over themselves endlessly. Whatever the truth, one fact remains unshaken. Every attempt to investigate his case, every journey into that forest, ends the same way, with silence, distortion, and the overwhelming feeling of being observed. The forest, it seems, has learned to protect its secret. And yet not all secrets are meant to rest. In 2023, a private expedition funded by a historical documentary network returned to the site with permission from the German government. The footage was never aired, but one of the crew members, before resigning and leaving the country, described a final scene recorded before their equipment shut down. The cameras had captured the interior of a newly unearthed bunker, sealed since the war. On one wall, scrawled in German, was a message written in charcoal. Ich bin nicht fort, ich bin zurück. I am not gone, I am back. The recording stopped there. No one knows what followed. Some say Falk's resonance continues to expand, feeding off every mention of his name, every digital echo, every retelling of his story. That by listening, by speaking his name aloud, you contribute to the signal, to the pulse that keeps the breach open just a little longer. Whether that's superstition or science depends on how much faith you have in coincidence, because sometimes coincidence looks a lot like design. And if you've reached this point, if you've listened to the end, then the signal has already touched you. Maybe faintly, maybe only in thought, but it's there, humming beneath the floor of your room, tracing your breath. The story of Heinrich Falk was never meant to end in 1944. It was meant to continue, to find new listeners, to ensure that the breach never fully closes. So before the static swallows this story and the silence resets, remember, like this video, leave your thoughts below and subscribe to the channel to keep this shadow alive. Because some stories, once uncovered, refuse to die quietly. And somewhere, beneath the frozen soil of Der leere Wald, something still walks, slowly, endlessly, searching for a way back.